If we squint really hard, we are.
That's Senior Beef Industry Analyst Lance Zimmerman with Rabo Research. We've been wondering all year, is herd rebuilding finally beginning, or are we just still talking about it? Well, today we're going to first set the stage as we discuss some of the recent news and disruptions across our beef industry. Then we'll break down the numbers, showing what heifer retention really looks like. From there, we'll dig into how long this market could realistically sustain this upcycle, what's driving it, and what's holding it back, before we wrap up with a perspective that ties this all together.
It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know with certainty that just ain't so.
A dynamic conversation with insight and perspective you will not want to miss. That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thank you for tuning in and joining us here on our program today. Well, I'll tell you what, this is a program you will not want to miss, as Lance Zimmerman joining us here on the program. And we're going to be trying to answer and talking and revolving around this question about heifer retention, we're going to be going into a lot of different facets that I think will be extremely valuable for any of us. If we're in the cow raising business, this is a show today you cannot afford to miss. So we're going to get to that in just a moment, but I did want to mention this first, and that is the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine is out. I think last week I'd mentioned to be looking for it in your mailbox after the show aired. I went out and there it was. It had come, and so I'm able to get through the latest issue. If you don't have a copy, you can stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick one up right there off the shelf, or you can start a subscription. It's easy to do by going to the website at workingranchmag.com. Well, as we get into our program here today, joining us as our guest is Lance Zimmerman. He is the Senior Animal Protein Analyst for Rabo Research, Food and Agribusiness. That, of course, is a part of Rabobank. And Lance, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks, Justin. Glad to be here.
Well, there is definitely no shortage of conversation these days in the beef industry when it comes to our markets. You know, probably for me, what's the more frustrating in any of this is just some of the division that it's brought out in the industry as well. I think that's unfortunate, and that's what I don't like to see.
As I was navigating through a lot of this, of course, a lot of the headwinds, the political headwinds around the trade deal with Argentina started showing up really the week before they ultimately hit. And we had the major, I guess you call it social media spat that ensued between the president and the U.S. cattle and beef producers. And obviously there were a lot of concerning statements made in the president's initial social media post, where he rightfully probably deserved the criticism from U.S. cattle and beef producers. But I also think it brought up far-reaching, deeply held political beliefs around a lot of different issues that were tertiary to the main discussion even at hand, that sometimes can cloud our vision and cloud our judgment and perspective on really what's going on in the moment with the specific matter at hand. And that can make things all the more emotional and all the more challenging to navigate. So yeah, you're right. It brought up probably some division within the industry we don't like. It brought up division across political aisles we don't like. And at the end of the day, we still have a lot of really great things to be excited about in this industry right ahead of the holiday season. And so, it kind of is a little bit of a black eye, maybe a little bit of a gut punch. But I am optimistic that time offers perspective, and we can all be better off for this as we continue to go down the road. Yeah.
Before we started here today, I said, we were going to mainly talk about some heifer retention numbers, and we didn't start there here this morning. I thought it was good to kind of have that discussion, but I think it lends itself to, and that's this. Fundamentally in our industry does give way to show that there's a lot of strength in this market, doesn't there?
There really is. And I don't think that, aside from maybe shaking our confidence a little bit about what in the world is the government doing and being involved in the beef industry, and what does that look like going forward, aside from that little bit of uncertainty, everything else still looks very strong from a beef industry standpoint. In fact, I would even say going into October, everybody was actually a little bit anxious with where prices were. Of course, if you're on the sell side, you loved it.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't? But we all recognize that almost everybody in the beef supply chain is a buyer and a seller. And so the sale feels really good, but then the anxiety tends to set in when the buy hits. For the cow-calf guy, that might be buying bred heifers or foregoing payment on those heifer calves because you're going to keep them on the ranch and knowing that you're giving up a record high profit on those heifer calves. For the feed yard guy, it's selling those record high fat cattle or near record high fat cattle over the last several weeks, but knowing that you are paying more for the replacement cattle coming in than you've ever paid before. Oh, and add to that the deferred futures, even before the recent break, still weren't giving you a chance to lock in a profit on those calves 6 months from now when you planned on selling them. To the packer, who, despite all of the rhetoric that the last couple of weeks brought out, is losing money left and right. And the challenges that exist there as they deal with having more capacity from a processing standpoint than we have cattle we can provide them. And so you look at some of that, and there are certainly some challenges around those record high prices that getting this break, even if it was temporal, allows everybody to establish some length in futures before they buy the physical cattle that actually may ensure a little bit of a lifeline from a profit standpoint. Maybe the cash to cash margins are still a little challenging, but man, you just had an opportunity as a feed yard to perhaps buy into a 10% break in the feeder cattle futures market where those deferred, some of them were about $40 cheaper in the futures market than the cash feeders were selling at. That's a great opportunity that you're going to take advantage of that volatility when given the chance. But overall, we're still in a marketplace that we know we're going to have less supplies tomorrow than we have today. And that's probably going to persist at least the next 2 years, probably the next 3,
really,
as we look towards aggressive heifer rebuilding. We're in a place right now where demand is exceptional. And unfortunately, as good of a market analyst as I and others are, we still can't forecast demand very well. And one of the best mechanisms we have of looking forward and projecting demand is to look over our shoulder and see what demand has been. And consumer beef demand at the retail level today is the highest it's been since 1983. And it's a huge testament to the entire beef industry, but those complements start at the cow-calf level because they're the ones that facilitate the genetics that serve as the foundation for our industry. And then everything we do from the minute that calf is conceived, we have to nurture and try to not screw up, right? Yeah. Whether that's through nutrition or health, whether it's through how we handle those cattle through the system, how we process and market that product. And let's be honest, the research that everybody does throughout the chain, whether it's through extension and universities, through private industry, and through funds like the checkoff, even as much of a political lightning rod as that can be, some of the best dollars we spend on a checkoff basis are on the research side in terms of return on investment for cattle producers. And so we're seeing the fruits of that right now. And that's really exciting. And that's something that even amid all this chaos doesn't really change. Those things tend to have a lot of staying power to those underlying fundamental trends.
Yeah. That's a good way, I think, we can set the foundation for where we want to go in our next segment. Because as I said, fundamentally, there's a lot of support there to our market. And I think really the question we've been asking ourselves for probably, we started at the beginning of the year, but we're still wanting to know is, are we seeing heifer retention starting? So when we come back in our next segment, that'll be my initial question to you, Lance, is, are we seeing heifer retention beginning to start? We'll get to that when we come back, okay? And now here's the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, with this.
Hey everybody, Tim here. We're fixing to come up on 1 million downloads of our Working Ranch radio show podcast, which is really exciting. And it got me to thinking about another viral moment that we had back in 2017 when we ran a short Facebook video of the Safety Zone calf catchers. And it was so popular, it got 6.8 million views in the first 5 days. I want you folks to check it out, Safety Zone calf catchers. It's a great product for all producers. Keep you safe when you're working with baby calves, especially for old timers like me who maybe can't outrun those cows anymore. Check them out, Safety Zone calf catchers.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone calf catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone calf catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505 0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
You know, as ranchers, when we make that investment in cattle protein supplements, one of the last things we want to do is spend all that money and then to see that supplement not do the job that we thought it was going to do. We're losing time in that. We're losing some money, and bigger than anything, we're losing herd performance. With SmartLick protein tubs, they deliver consistent self-fed nutrition, improving conception, calf health, gains, helping these cows get built back after weaning that calf off. With SmartLick protein tubs, they are backed by research that have been trusted nationwide. SmartLick protein tubs save labor while boosting reproduction, calf health, and returns. No wasted effort, just proven results. Feed smarter, not harder. To find out more or to find your local SmartLick dealer, go to their website today at smartlick.com. Okay, Lance, let's get into one of the main reasons that we wanted to talk here today. And as we said in the last segment, really kind of setting the table for the rest of our conversation here today as we continue to look at our beef industry, or cattle industry, I should say. And that is, we've been mulling this around. We've been wanting to know. Of course, we have government shutdown. Some numbers aren't coming in like we'd hope they would come in, all this kind of stuff. But so initially, let's start here with this very broad question. And I know we can start to narrow in a little bit more with some finer points, but are we seeing heifer retention underway?
If we squint really hard, we are. And I say that with a little bit of laughter in my voice. But there's a couple little things going on behind the scenes. One, we can absolutely say with confidence, we're not liquidating beef cows today. Cow slaughter is at multi-year lows. The culling rate will be below 10%, which is kind of the long run average culling rate we have, where we say, gosh, we get under 10%, we're kind of in stabilization mode. We get below 9%, we're probably in retention mode and herd rebuilding mode. And the latest numbers, again, we need the official government data, and we need to get through this year to kind of see where the dust settles on 2025. But it looks like our culling rate will be below 9% this year. And so really what it all depends on is the question you hit at. What's the heifer retention side look like? And one of the things as a market analyst that we always have to do is look at a variety of different sources of data and see how they line up as we work through the course of the year. And so there's really three main sets of data that I try to look at. One is weekly data that we get from the government that speaks to what is the number of heifers, or the percentage of heifers in feeder cattle and calf auctions across the U.S. And the government provides a weekly summary report of all the different cattle auctions around the country and some aggregate numbers in regard to that. And that data right now has our percentage of heifers in that sales mix down about 1.5 percentage points compared to last year. Okay. Still a far cry from where we would have been during the 14, 15, 16 kind of rebuilding efforts. When that number was in the mid 30%, we're still sitting there right at around 40% today, but we're moving the right direction, albeit slowly. The other number we like to look at is what's the percentage of heifers on feed. Well, you mentioned we're in this government shutdown right now. We'd know what that number looks like on a quarterly basis because we would get that snapshot on January 1, on April 1, July 1, and October 1. Well, we're missing the October 1 data because we haven't gotten that cattle on feed report with the shutdown. So we'll see. But up to this point in time, we were seeing a similar drop in the percentage of heifers on feed based on that July 1 cattle on feed report. And then the last one is always, what does that heifer mix look like in slaughter? And kind of what did we end up seeing? Because the thing we have to keep in mind is the cattle on feed report, much like the cattle inventory report that we get twice a year, it's a survey. It's not infallible. It's only as good as the sample being surveyed. The sales data at kind of the end of the pasture gate, and then the slaughter data, it's official data. It's market reporters watching those calf sales across the country. It's pretty close to accurate and real. And then the slaughter data is about as absolute as it gets. If it got to slaughter, we're measuring it, we're checking it, we're sexing it, we're understanding what's there. And so all of that data would say we're trending the right direction, but it's incredibly slow. And that's not lost on me.
Yeah.
In fact, when I started in this position a little over 3.5 years ago, the very first paper I wrote with Robo Research was literally titled "Not So Fast." This herd rebuild's going to take time. And that's exactly how it's played out. And so our 2024 beef cow inventory on January 1 was just a little bit around 28 million head. This past year's number was just a little bit under 28 million head. I think we'll get back to 28 or maybe 100,000 head above 28 million head for this upcoming January report. Whether you look at 24, 25, or 26 beef cow numbers, statistically, they're the same cow herd. At the back of those cattle inventory reports, the government will publish a confidence interval. And the 10% confidence interval around that beef cow number is 250,000 head. And so whether it's last year's cow number, this year's, or what I'm expecting for next year, it's statistically the exact same cow herd.
Okay.
Really, as we look at it, we got to look ahead to 27 and really 28 and 29 before we're probably going to see meaningful herd growth.
Yeah. Well, and that was my question to you. With the slowness and the cautiousness that we're seeing in this rebuild point, kind of spell that out over these next several years. And when do you see that potential peak returning again?
Yeah. Well, and one thing I should have mentioned as I was talking about those percentage mixes in terms of how many heifers versus steers, I do want to mention one other thing. Data quality matters, and our industry can change at times. And we've seen different fluctuations in our industry over time at different periods of time. And there is a meaningful one that we're not talking enough about between the rebuilding efforts of 2013 through 2017 and the rebuild that we're just starting to see now. And that is the growth and acceptance of beef dairy cross cattle.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened as we saw dairy operations leaning more into beef bull semen for their breedings is a component of that allowed them to use that beef semen is they took their top performing cows and heifers on the dairy operation and they bred them to sexed heifer semen, right? So that they guaranteed that they got their pool of replacement heifers out of that herd. And then they took the balance of those cows and bred them to, more often than not, Angus bull semen, but not necessarily always the case. And it was just run-of-the-mill semen. So 50-50 chance of steer or heifer pregnancy. But by and large, by taking a segment of that population and breeding them to a guaranteed heifer pregnancy out the gate, the dairy industry's actually created more heifers for us in the feedlot segment because of that sex semen being used on those targeted replacement breeding. And so CattleFax, where I came from, spent 12 years there prior to this current career. They started digging into that beef dairy deal 3 years ago, 3.5, 4 years ago when I was working for them and really trying to get their arms around where are we at with beef dairy cross numbers? What does it mean to the steer heifer mix coming out of those dairy operations? And what does it mean to total supplies? And what their numbers would suggest, and I think they're as close to the gospel on that segment of the industry as anything, they would say as we look at these traditional percent of heifers coming out of sale barns, coming out of feed yards, going through slaughter, that we're probably capturing an extra 1.5 percentage points in that heifer mix because of what dairies have contributed. Okay. And so when we talk about, looking at those numbers coming out of sale barns and we're at 40 to 40.5% heifers, if we want to make it synonymous with where we were in, let's say 2013, we're actually closer to about probably 38%, 38.5%, because we got to back out an extra percentage point and a half from that underlying data. Mm-hmm. And so let's keep that in mind too, as we're kind of trying to draw a line in the sand as to where are we today, maybe compared to the last cycle. I would argue we're probably closer to 2013, right on the beginning of a really rapid buildup in replacement heifer numbers, but we're not there yet. And so when we talk about then, what does that look like for peak and heifer retention activity? I think I'm really looking ahead to the next 2 to 3 fall runs. Okay. And so this year is probably just we're getting in the right direction, but we're not dipping in the water with both sets of feet just yet. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest reasons is almost all of our cattle ranchers that exist out there are part-time operators. What I mean by that is the average herd size in the U.S. is 40 head. You're not providing a family income off of 40 head. It means you're running the operation while you also have a grain business or a hay business, or you're working a job in town. You're running cows because dad did, grandpa did before you, and you want to maintain that lifestyle for your family. And that's fantastic. But what it also means is we have a whole lot of folks right now that are probably farmers that run a few cattle. That cattle are the only thing keeping the whole family enterprise afloat right now, because grain and oil seed profits aren't good. To our friends in the Pacific Northwest, they can tell you, depending on where they're at, produce margins aren't very good either. The cattle business is what's holding things together right now. So that $1,000 a head cash to cash profit some operations are talking about for this year, it's getting spread across a lot of different enterprises. And I think that's actually probably one of the biggest challenges to seeing a little bit more robust expansion activity right here and now. And I'm hopeful that as we get a little more distance behind us, the optimism will prove itself out longer. The track record will prove itself out a little bit more, and we'll see a little bit more aggressiveness in that heifer retention the next few years.
Yeah. Well, you hit on something with the beef on dairy that I wasn't quite sure how we were going to get to that in our conversation here today, because I saw that and it is something that I do want to talk a little bit more about. I want to take a quick break here, and I want to come back to that just real quick because we still have quite a bit more that I do know we want to get to here, but I'll hit that when we come back, and then we'll continue talking about some of the factors that are affecting herd rebuilding that's going on as well. So we'll do that when we come back.
Molly Manufacturing's all-purpose corral is perfect for any farming operation. With over 3,200 square feet of heavy-duty paneling, the all-purpose corral is the ultimate farm and ranch tool for livestock of any size. It's the industry standard in low-stress livestock handling and safety. One corral, endless possibilities. The all-purpose corral from Molly is better by design. Find out more at mollymfg.com.
As we continue on here today, my guest is Lance Zimmerman. He is the Senior Beef Industry Analyst for Rabo Research, Food and Agribusiness. They are a part of Rabobanks, of course. And Lance, as we left in the last segment, I said I wanted to get back a little bit. And I won't spend too much time, but I do want to kind of go back a little bit on that beef on dairy conversation that we were having, because as I told you at break, I said I feel like sometimes us I'm going to say beef, meaning the non-dairy beef producers, cattle producers, okay, we're going to get caught up in some of these industry issues that are going on and infighting with ourselves. In the meantime, we got a dairy industry that's doing things that maybe if we're not careful, we could get left on the sidelines.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting how many milk producers now find themselves paying a lot more attention to their role in the beef industry. Working at a major food and ag bank, you get exposed to all the different sectors. And certainly in the last year, I've gotten involved in a lot more discussions with dairy producers as they realize just how significant that calf check is to their entire operations profits. But I do think that there's two sides to that discussion. One, I think to your point, dairy producers, by and large, they lean more into genetic technology and the application of that at a much higher rate than the traditional U.S. beef cow-calf producer. A lot of that has to do with just the very nature of that dairy business, and those cows are closer to working facilities. Those animals are handled every single day, and that's not how the cow-calf business largely operates. A lot of those ranches across the West where you have, tens, 20s, hundreds of acres per pair. You're turning those cows out after calving time. You may not see them until you bring them back for weaning. And so some of that's due to just the very structure of our business. But I think that the dairy industry over time, because they've always embraced those genetic technologies, they're so data driven. They have a lot of consistency in their genetics and in their production models that they can lean on. The trade-off, though, is they still are milk producers first. And if the milk side of the business isn't profitable, they're not going to bring more animals into production. And so we do have a natural limit that I think we're going to hit in terms of how many of those animals the dairy industry produces for the beef industry. But again, coming full circle back to CattleFax's numbers, let's just draw a line in the sand and say, exclude the last 5 years. and look at what the industry did from essentially the early 2000s all the way through the late 2010s, the dairy industry produced between 3 and 3.5 million fed cattle for the beef industry through their dairy offspring annually. Today, that number is, instead of 3 to 3.5 million dairy fed cattle, it's more like 4 to 4.5 million. That million head increase more recently compared to that prior period is due in part to the beef on dairy production model, but it's also due in equal parts for a couple other things that happened behind the scenes. One, as they got more intentional with their replacement heifer program, they realized they didn't need to breed as many animals for replacement heifers. And so we gained a few more fed dairy pregnancies that we wouldn't have had normally. Another big shift that's happened over the last 5 years is a dramatic decline in demand for veal. Okay. There's a lot of animal welfare concerns around that production model. And I think just in general, the U.S. consumer has lost a taste for that product.
Sure.
And so we were able to gain some dairy-fed cattle because those cattle quite simply weren't going into veal production anymore. In 2019, we would have had veal slaughter at about 575,000 head. This year, it'll be around 135,000 head. And so we gained about 450,000 head of dairy-fed cattle from veal production. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing that we got to keep in mind is, as we've went from a purebred Holstein animal to more of a beef dairy cross, those calves have gained some viability. Those calves hit the ground a lot more alert, and everybody is much more focused on those calves making it to the next stage of production because there's a lot more value in those calves. And so better viability of the calf to start with, met with more intentional health and nutrition management all the way through, has improved the capture of those calves and continuing them through the chain at a level that we didn't see before when those animals were simply a means to additional milk production. And I think so as we go forward, they are an asset from a beef production standpoint because we took an animal that we were getting in the beef industry anyway, but it had some muscle conformation issues. It had some acceptance issues at the consumer level, where now, at least for a percentage of that population, we're able to improve the product quality and lean into some of the consistency that dairy genetics offer and create some very coordinated supply chains because of that. And they do offer some really enticing data management streams because, again, individual animal ID, individual animal management, it's what the dairy industry lives, eat, and breathes every single day. And so I do think as we have more industry discussions about animal ID, traceability, genetic improvement, and just progress and demonstrating that progress to our partners downstream, the dairy industry has lived in that space for decades. And there's probably a lot that we can learn from them as we try to apply some of their lessons to our own production models on the beef space.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue in our discussion of heifer retention. Like you said when I asked you that question, if we squint real good, we can start to see a little heifer retention. So let's go through some of these things that are affecting those. Right off the bat, I think we have to be I think everybody knows inflation, input costs. They have definitely, they're a lot different than they were 5 years ago.
Yeah, they are. And it's funny. I literally was just... somebody shared with me a social media post earlier this morning, and it was in light of how our discussion began today, talking about the social media posts of our current White House administration. But the post brought light to, beef prices aren't expensive. I think, I can't remember what the time horizon was, but they basically said beef prices were up 400% over this particular time horizon, but that they also had on that same table the price of a pickup, the price of a tractor, the price of a Coca-Cola. All of them far outpaced the price increase that we were seeing at the beef, retail meat case, for instance. And so I think that captures exactly what you're saying. Whether you're talking about farm inputs for our friends in crop production, whether you're talking about equipment prices that we all have to deal with when we're in food and ag, or whether you're talking about something as basic as just other food items. There's a lot of other areas of inflation that are competing with our consumers' dollar and with our cattle producers' dollar at a level that we've not seen in recent history, that we're all having to adjust our calculus for today.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, as we look 5 years back, we're like, wow, I didn't realize how much it's really cost now to run a cow. And we really do need to know our numbers of what it costs us to run a cow to know where we're at.
It does. And I think, that is one of the things that a number of operations are either in the midst of fall weaning. Maybe they already weaned and sold those calves, but this is a discussion that's near and dear to my heart because it goes back to my thesis research. Oh gosh, more than 15 years ago now, where I looked at video auction market data that literally broke out all the different management practices of calves that were selling on video auction markets. And what I was doing was measuring what the dollar per hundredweight return to management was for things like dehorning, weaning, a VAC 45 program that was certified versus somebody just putting in the listing, they had all their shots. Somebody listing very specific breed characteristics of the Angus bulls that they sired those calves mamas to, compared to a guy that just said, they're just good reputation blacks.
Yeah.
And literally putting dollar per hundredweight differences to each of those. And one of the things that's fascinating when you get to a point where you have record high prices is producers want to say, well, why would I go through all of the effort of weaning these calves and vaccinating them when I could just, everybody's getting high prices now? Well, even for as much as the calf price has gone up, last I checked, and I don't want to give any ideas to your advertisers, but Zoetis, Merck, and all the others that exist, I don't think they have a floating vaccine price that as cattle prices go up, they just attach the price of that vaccination program to the value of the calf, nor do most vet services say, your price for preg checking this year is going to go up 50% because that's what the calf price went up. The net return on good management is higher today than it's ever been in the last 5 to 10 years, because we have a calf price that's far outpacing right now the price of some of those goods, not necessarily all of them, but also let's think about what the consequence is of underperformance. So I think it's good at this point in time when prices are as high as they are to really be assessing all of those different costs of management, because some areas you're going to find may have went up far more than you thought. Others may not have gone up nearly as much. And so maybe it's not as prudent to just be looking at cutting cost across the board. We got to be picky about where we pick and choose to fine tune our operations.
Yeah. There's a discussion there that's kind of making me think here about some management decisions I've made here.
Understood. I think we all have to question them right now. But at the beginning of the year, one of the papers I wrote was called Beefing Up, and strategies that the entire beef industry from cow calf all the way to end user had to realize in this higher price environment. And one of the things I talked about was we talk about risk management a lot in the beef and cattle business, and our minds almost always gravitate to price risk management, futures, options, LRP, LGM. Mm-hmm. But risk management goes far beyond that. It's also, what's the risk in if you cease to be around tomorrow? Who's taken over the operation? Or, if you're bringing family back, we all want more sons and daughters coming back to farms and ranches. That's means our communities are more vibrant, our businesses are more vibrant, and more support goes into the industry as a whole to facilitate that next generation. But you hate to talk about a prenup at the same time you bring a new family member back to the operation, but there is a risk if it doesn't work out with your son or daughter and that spouse they bring along. Well, then all of a sudden the farm or ranch at risk of having to be split up to satisfy that annulment, that marriage agreement, that divorce, whatever that may be. Mental health. I think after the last couple of weeks, maybe after last year, we all are more cognizant of mental health than ever before.
Yeah,
but even just the cost of a breakdown. Does your local dealership have the parts you need if your tractor breaks down? Or are you driving hours away to go get the parts you need to get hay put up or to get the cattle fed this winter? There's a lot of different stressors from a risk management standpoint that I think we need to be on top of today, because our entire supply chain is a lot more vulnerable with a lot of the tariff and the volatility that we've gone through in the last year.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a quick break here. I want to continue on as we talk about factors affecting herd health. You just mentioned a bit ago about we want more sons or daughters coming back to the ranch. Boy, that's an element too that's part of this discussion. We're going to get to that when we come back.
It all starts with a tag. Identifying each animal allows you to better manage the entire herd and control your operation's future. For nearly 70 years, producers have chosen Allflex for individual animal management. With Allflex, you get the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions. Whether you need stock or custom visual tags, electronic tags, tissue sampling units for DNA collection, or syringes, bring the Allflex advantage to your operation today. Visit allflexusa.com to learn more.
All right, Lance, as we continue on, we were talking the first factor affecting herd building was rising input costs, as we talked about that. The next thing, and I think this is definitely something out there, is access to pasture land. That's something that for those that have the cattle business, even down to those wanting to get in, maybe it's a young producer wanting to get in. It's kind of tough.
It is, and as we were going through the chaos of the social media posts and trade with Argentina, the USDA did release a 13-page white paper talking about different aspects of how they were going to try and encourage the U.S. cow-calf segment in these rebuilding efforts. And one of the things, there were a lot of good things in that report. Expanded access and tools for risk management, helping with the management of invasive predators. I think it specifically mentioned, the wolf population as well as black vultures, expanded access to some of the public grazing lands, whether it be Forestry Service or BLM permits. But it probably stopped just a little bit short of what I hoped it would in terms of helping the younger generations with farm transfer. And what I mean by that is I'm not just a market analyst. I grew up in the business. I live in Kansas. I'm on the eastern side of Kansas just for the need of being closer to airports for travel. But my family operations in western Kansas. My brother runs it today. We're in conversation with each other every so many days. We can drive around in that area of the country. And just by driving by a place, and I'm sure this is no different than where you are, Justin, or many of your listeners, you just drive by a place and tell if it's owned by that operator who's grazing cattle or it's rented. The reason is because the fence that's there actually has been updated in our lifetimes on an owned property. If it's a rented property, it's probably being held together with a lot of baling wire. It's probably got an electric fence strung around the interior perimeter, fortifying it. I think we have a lot of producers out there today that the 2013, 14 to kind of 17 rebuilding effort was their last rodeo. And after they kind of got kicked in the butt by the market from 2017 all the way to 2022, they're kind of looking at it today and they're maybe in their late 60s, 70s, or 80s, and they're saying, not ready for another one of those again. And so are there opportunities out there where the government, could sit back and say, hey, if you're willing to sell this piece of ground to a producer who has none today, or a producer of a certain age, we're going to give you a tax break on that. Or, let the government facilitate a loan program where it's got really competitive terms to that young gentleman or lady who wants to take over this operation, but we get you your money right up front. And maybe we give you some really unique tax breaks in the process. Or, maybe you're sitting there as part of a trust, and there's only one person that's a part of that trust that's in production agriculture today, and they can't afford to buy out the other 3 or 4 family members because they know it's going to appraise at a much higher value than its productive value is. Well, what are some things the government can do to facilitate that transfer of assets? Because I think today, and I say this speaking for a bank, what's fair isn't always equal and what's equal isn't always fair. And we realize that, I think, today with estate planning, much more so than maybe the previous generation did, where before they felt like the only way to be fair was to divide it up equally. And the reality is that's caused us some headaches in transition over the last 20 years that I think we're still working through. We're getting better at it, but we're still working through some of those pain points today.
Yeah. As you talk about that, I think that transition, that's been a big thing of many topics that we've had on our show here, is addressing that transition, because I feel mainly from my own experience and then what I see in the industry as a whole being one of the biggest reasons why we are losing producers. It was a place mom and dad ran on, and they, kind of barely made it run, and then they split it up 4 ways. And how is 4 quarters of one maybe profitable every so and again year operation, how are they going to make that work?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think we're in a situation where I think the last census of ag, they broke out age by different producer group. The cow-calf guy, the guy running cattle, was the oldest of any of them at like 58 and some odd years. And I think as we look at this going forward, that shapes our appetite for a lot of different things. But one of the biggest ones that it shapes is our attitude for risk. As we get older, we get less risk averse, or we get more risk averse. We're less of a risk taker. My dad rebuilt the family operation from scratch. His dad passed away when he was in junior high. I was joking with somebody the other day. It's been a while, but I can remember Mom cutting up hot dogs, throwing them in sauerkraut, boiling them, and then serving them on mashed potatoes. And so we talk about high food prices. There's means to cheapening up that dinner plate. My mom can tell us about it. I knew we finally made it in the cattle business when Dad said we didn't need to eat the liver that was in the deep freeze, and instead I could use it as fish bait. And mark my words, Justin, whether I caught fish that day with it or not, that liver stayed at the pond, and so I mentioned all that, and I went on a big tangent there to say that younger producers are going to be willing to place more bets on this rebuild than the generation that probably has been managing it the last several decades. Yeah. I think it's just a means of how do we find a good exit lane for those older producers to maintain the wealth that they've built, to give them an opportunity to still maintain a connection to that land that they stewarded, but also get the chance to see a younger producer do some really great things with it. And so I often tell producers, you mentioned we're seeing operations get bigger. That's the other side of the risk. As we look at the cattle business today, but the same point still exists. We talked in the earlier segment about risk management. Mm-hmm. As we look at this going forward, 1, younger operators are going to be more willing to take that risk, but 2, bigger operators are going to have the working capital and equity it built up to withstand some of those bad bets that inevitably are going to happen. And so one of the things that I've told producers, the reason why this rebuild perhaps is going to play out over a longer time horizon and be slower is because it's going to depend on a Venn diagram of 2 intersecting circles, right? Mm-hmm. If we're all familiar with how a Venn diagram looked from our school days, the one circle is going to be those producers who are young enough that they're willing to take the bet and understand that the payout on rebuilding this herd is going to play out over a 10 plus year time horizon. Yeah. That's one circle in this Venn diagram. The other circle is those operations who are big enough to weather the storms that inevitably are going to come up and affect everybody in this business. And it's the intersection of those 2 circles that our herd rebuild depends on. Mm-hmm. Those big operations that have a generational transition plan in place where younger producers are willing to take over the management of that operation going forward. And when we think about our industry today, you probably attend as many industry meetings or more than I do in a year. We know, looking around those rooms, the intersection of those circles and who that represents in a meeting room is an incredibly small group of people. Now, I think the future is exceptionally bright for those folks willing to do that and take that risk. And the rewards of making sure that handoff is good have never been greater, but it's a small population in our industry that we're talking about.
Yeah, there's so much I think to think about as you say that. I think it identifies where we're at with everything, and I think if you just step back and think about what you just said, I think it makes a lot of sense for folks. When we come back here, it'll be our final segment, Lance, as we tail out our conversation here today based upon what we have talked about. Just some points that you want to just share with producers as they look ahead for these next several years and looking ahead in that. So we'll get to that when we come back, okay? In a world of variables that are beyond our control, there's a tool that can provide certainty for your breeding program. I'm talking about Identity Beef. It's the first genomic profile designed for crossbred commercial cattle. Now, here's a tool that's going to utilize DNA to rank the genetic merit for 17 key traits, from maternal to performance to carcass traits, as well as mitigate risk factors, for example, like congestive heart failure. It's time to take the gamble and the waiting game out of your breeding program. Make accurate decisions with confidence and uncover your herd's potential with Identity Beef. To learn more, contact your Neogen representative today or visit neogen.com/identity-beef. As we look ahead and based upon our conversation here today, as you're sitting down with producers, your ranchers, and of course, as you said, your own family ranching operation, as we begin to look ahead, tailing out into this year and looking ahead for the next several years in this rebuilding cycle that we see ourselves in, just a couple points that you want to leave producers to just be, thinking of or aware of as they're going through this.
In the basically since this summer, I've been leading a lot of my presentations with a quote, and the quote is from, of all people, Mark Twain, the author of The Adventures of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, a Missouri native originally. And he has a quote that has some folksy kind of Missouri wisdom to it, but I think it's really pertinent in this discussion. He says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know with certainty that just ain't so." And I think, especially in light of the last couple of weeks we've been through, maybe that quote could never have served us with more wisdom and more of an internal gut check moment than it does right now. But I think in this phase of herd rebuilding, and as we all look to our own operations and what the future of them look like, let's keep our eyes open, right? It's kind of like Mom all told us growing up that, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. It's wise for us all to be very measured in how we rebuild going forward and think about some really challenging industry discussions going forward. We've had a lot of them brought to the forefront, either intentionally or unintentionally, over the last several weeks. And I think that as we then take those big picture industry discussions, but we really try to just clear out the noise a little bit and go right down to what does it mean for our operation. I think that that's what's going to be most important here going forward. We're going to be in an environment where prices, I believe, even with this temporary setback that we've seen to the futures market here over the last several weeks, prices are going to continue to grind higher these next several years if we believe 2 things fundamentally. One, that supplies aren't going to get significantly bigger anytime soon. And when I say soon, I mean the next 3 years. By my expectations, we're probably going to have our biggest year-over-year supply break next year, not because we're leaning so aggressively into heifer retention. I'd love for that to be the case. But the reality is we've not been importing feeder cattle and calves from Mexico for most of this last 12-month period. We've had some periods of time here and there where we flipped that switch back on again. But essentially, we should have probably seen around 800 to 900,000 Mexican feeder cattle imports this year. We've seen closer to about 200,000.
Okay.
And so the reality is those cattle are on feed in the U.S. for about 300 days when they get here. They're lighter weight calves. Most of that beef production decline is not hitting this year. It's hitting next year. And so we're going to see a pretty big reduction in per capita supplies next year. And then in my opinion, the 2 years following that'll be additional reductions due to heifer retention.
Yeah.
And so as we look at that alone is going to be supportive to price if you just think that demand's going to hold steady. I'm of the opinion that, yes, the consumer is stressed today, but the consumer is trading within the channel, not trading out of it. A lot of the historical data that we have on beef prices compared to pork and poultry and what we call elasticities, how a change in price in one good changes consumption patterns in the other. A lot of that cross-price elasticity research between beef, pork, and poultry is pretty old, done in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. There was some research that got lost during the pandemic that was done in 2017 that actually showed the cross price effect, the substitution effect between beef, pork, and poultry had eroded. That beef was kind of distancing itself from pork and poultry and stood out on its own. That same research said that the income price effect to beef strengthened. In other words, if beef prices continued to go up, consumers would still buy the same amount of beef as long as their income situation stayed the same or improved. Mm-hmm. Where beef demand was at risk was if consumer incomes dropped. And so that tells me that as long as we don't get into a situation where either consumer incomes drop or inflation doesn't reduce the purchasing power of each consumer dollar earned, we shouldn't be too worried about beef demand if we have confidence in what we're producing and that we're going to continue to see gains made in prime and choice grading and some of these higher quality branded programs. So if that's the case, we should have confidence that over the next 2 to 3 years, beef prices and cattle prices can continue to go up. Now, I do believe the easy gains are probably behind us. We probably won't see another year like 2025 and even the tail end of 2024 these next couple of years. But I do think upward price momentum still exists in this market. And so how do we plan for that accordingly as we think about heifer retention, as we think about how we're going to market our calves, and how we think about managing risk? And so I think those are some really important considerations. And then we kind of talked about it earlier, and I want to keep the time horizon in mind with how long we're recording here, but also how do we look ahead? And not just the here and now, not just the next 3 years as we look to rebuilding our herds, but as we look at our own operations, what is our goal for our future? What do we want to leave our kids? What do we want to make sure our legacy is as we build this ranch with our brand on it? And how does that look? And what does that mean for laying some investments down in some other areas, perhaps outside of the cattle herd? Whether it's in the family that's around you, whether it's in some other infrastructure, perhaps a feed yard, perhaps a farming enterprise, perhaps a processing plant. And what are you going to do to make sure that as you get ready to exit that business, you're leaving your kids, perhaps your grandkids, perhaps your nieces and nephews, something that they can be as excited about running and growing and building as you were.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, your closing statements there kind of just did a really good job of summarizing a lot of our topic here today. I know we hit some different things, but very good advice. I think this is I know this is the first time I think you and I have ever had a conversation, and very good. I think it was very helpful, especially where we're at in light of what's happened the last couple of weeks. And then, as I said, looking ahead for us. So thank you for your conversation here today. I know it was good for me. I hope for folks listening. Well, I know it is. They're going to find it very valuable. So thank you for taking the time to be with us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks you. I enjoyed it, Justin.
You bet. And again, our guest here today, Lance Zimmerman, Senior Animal Protein Analyst for Rabo Research Food and Agribusiness. Of course, they are part of Rabo Banks. Always appreciate his insight into our industry. He's been doing this for an awful long time. And if you're like me and you kind of like to know what some of these guys like him are thinking about different topics in our industry, not only now, but as they come up, if you want to follow along with some of the information that he puts out on a regular basis, you can go to the website at rabo.nl/Lance Zimmerman. Again, that website is rabo.nl/Lance Zimmerman. I will also put that link in our show notes, so be looking for that. We'll be back after this. Well, if you missed something here today and you want to go back and listen to what we talked about with our guest, Lance Zimmerman, you can go to our podcast site at workingranchrradio.com, or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can do it from that source as well. And also be sure to leave us a rating or a review. That's very helpful. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.